It was the most humiliating day, but also the day that changed my life forever. Hello, I am Jeremy Morgan, 36 years old, the founder and CEO of a real estate and investment conglomerate with a network spanning across the United States. People often describe me as a successful entrepreneur, a bold leader, and a living testament to building a career from nothing. But 10 years ago, I was just a 27-year-old guy living in a rundown apartment in the suburbs of Chicago, working at a financial firm with a salary barely enough to cover rent and a few meals a day. I had no grand dreams, no ambitious plans. I was just trying not to get swept away in the rush of life, searching for a foothold, some kind of meaning for myself. But I always felt lost, as if the whole world knew where they belonged and I didn't. My family was not an ordinary one. My grandfather, Edward Morgan, was a legend. He started from nothing and built Morgan Enterprises, a real estate and investment empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was a stern, reserved man, but his eyes were always sharp, as if they could see through a person's soul. I grew up in his towering shadow, hearing stories of his intelligence, decisiveness, and sometimes ruthlessness in the business world. But I wasn't close to him. It wasn't that I didn't want to be, but he always seemed to keep his distance from everyone, including me, the only grandson carrying the Morgan name. When he passed away, my entire family, from my parents to my aunts, uncles, and cousins, gathered at the lawyer's office in downtown Chicago. It was a freezing winter day, the sky gray and ominous, as if foreshadowing something grim. I still remember the feeling of stepping into that room, with its luxurious wood-paneled walls, a long, polished table, and dozens of calculating eyes sizing each other up. Everyone in the family knew my grandfather's will would change their lives. They all expected their share, a mansion in the suburbs, company stocks, or at least a cash sum enough to live comfortably for life. I sat at the corner of the table, trying to make myself as small as possible. I didn't expect much. I knew I had no real standing in this family. My father, Robert Morgan, my grandfather's eldest son, was the primary operator of Morgan Enterprises and always took pride in taking over his father's empire. My mother, a sharp and ambitious woman, constantly reminded me that I needed to do something to prove I was worthy of the Morgan name. My aunts, uncles, and cousins all seemed ready to claim their piece. As for me, I just hoped not to be called out, not to be noticed, not to be compared. But fate never let me off easily. My grandfather's lawyer, Mr. Harold Grayson, an elderly man with a deep voice and gold-rimmed glasses, began reading the will. The room was deathly silent, interrupted only by the sound of turning pages and tense breathing. Names were called one by one, along with assets that left me stunned. My father inherited my grandfather's main estate in Lake Forest and 40% of Morgan Enterprises shares. My Aunt Ellen, my father's sister, was granted 3 properties in Florida and California. My cousin James, a few years older than me and always considering himself the prime heir, received $2 million in cash and a penthouse in the heart of Manhattan. The list went on, with numbers and properties I could only dream of in my wildest fantasies. Then it was my turn. The entire room turned to look at me. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I wasn't expecting anything grand, but a small part of me still hoped. Hoped that my grandfather, the man I always respected despite never truly understanding, had left me something, a sign that he saw me, that he believed in me. Jeremy Morgan, Mr. Grayson read, his voice steady but his gaze lingering on me a little longer than usual. Mr. Edward Morgan leaves you a wooden box containing 5 sealed letters. Silence. A suffocating silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then the laughter started. It began with a chuckle from Aunt Ellen, followed by a louder laugh from James. My father didn't laugh, but he shook his head, his disappointment unmistakable. My mother whispered something to the person next to her, her eyes sharp as knives. My other cousins started murmuring, their words cutting into me like blades. A wooden box? That's what he gets? Some letters? Grandfather sure knew how to pick his air. The laughter grew louder, like a wave drowning me. I sat there, my face burning, blood rushing to my ears. I wanted to stand up to shout that I didn't need anything from my grandfather, that I hadn't expected anything at all. But I couldn't. I just sat there, clenching my fists under the table, trying not to let anyone see the tears welling in my eyes. Mr. Grayson placed a small, weathered wooden box in front of me, its surface worn smooth by time. It was nothing special. No carvings, no gemstones, just an ordinary wooden box you might find in an antique shop for a few dollars. Inside, as he had said, were 5 sealed letters neatly arranged, each sealed with a faded red wax stamp. I touched them, feeling the rough texture of the paper under my fingertips, and a strange sensation welled up inside me. It wasn't hope, nor was it disappointment. It was like a question, a mystery I didn't know how to unravel. "That's it?" James spoke up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Grandfather sure knew how to surprise people. "Jeremy, you should open a post office. That'd suit your pile of letters." The room erupted in laughter again. I didn't respond. I just stared at the box, feeling something heavy pressing down on my chest. After the will reading, I left the lawyer's office without saying a word to anyone. I didn't want to see the pity in my mother's eyes or hear more mockery from James. Clutching the wooden box, I stepped out onto the freezing Chicago streets, the wind cutting through me, making me shiver. I felt smaller than ever, as if the whole world was laughing at me. I had hoped, even just a little, that my grandfather would leave me something. Not money or property, but a sign that he believed in me. That he didn't see me as the useless person my family thought I was. Back at my apartment, I set the box on the kitchen table and stared at it for hours. I didn't want to open it. Part of me was afraid of being disappointed again, and part of me didn't want to face the reality that this was all my grandfather had left me. But curiosity eventually won. I grabbed a letter opener and carefully broke the wax seal on the first envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, the strong, resolute handwriting unmistakably my grandfather's. The message was brief but made my heart race. "Jeremy, you are the only one I've chosen to carry out this task. Deliver the remaining 5 letters to the addresses I've provided. If you succeed, a part of the true legacy will await you. Don't let me down." Below the message was a list of 5 addresses stretching from Ohio to Illinois. No explanations, no hints. Just a simple yet enigmatic request: deliver these letters. I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. What was this? A joke? A test? Or just my grandfather's way of mocking me even after he was gone? My family was right. Maybe I was just an unwilling mailman, the punchline to my grandfather's final joke. But deep down, a small voice whispered that these weren't just letters. Something bigger, something more significant was waiting for me. I didn't know it then, but I had just embarked on a journey that would change my life forever. Those letters weren't just paper and ink. They were the key to the lessons my grandfather had spent his life learning, and now he wanted me to learn them the hardest, most authentic way possible. But before I could understand that, I had to face humiliation, doubt, and myself. That day, I didn't just receive a wooden box. I received a challenge, and I had no idea that it was the first day I began building my own empire. I placed the wooden box on the kitchen table, staring at it, my heart filled with doubt. A part of me wanted to throw it away, to forget everything that had happened in that lawyer's office. But another part, smaller but more stubborn, whispered that this wasn't just a joke. My grandfather, the man with piercing eyes and profound wisdom, never did anything without purpose. Perhaps, just perhaps, this box held something far greater than I could imagine. I opened the first letter, my grandfather's resolute handwriting appearing before my eyes. The message was brief but weighty. Deliver the first letter to Marco Rossi, 1427 Maple Street, Springfield, Ohio. Complete this task and you will understand. No explanation, no hints. Just an address and a stranger's name. I looked at the 4 remaining letters, their red wax seals almost taunting me. My family was right. I was just a messenger, an errand boy in my grandfather's bizarre will. But I had nothing to lose. My job was dull, my life unremarkable. If this was a game, I'd play it to the end, if only to prove I wasn't the failure they thought I was. I took 3 days off work, mustering all my courage to begin this journey. Springfield, Ohio was over 5 hours' drive from Chicago. I placed the wooden box on the passenger seat of my old Honda Civic, its engine groaning as if complaining about the trip. The long road stretched ahead, and I turned on the radio to drown out the chaotic thoughts in my head. But I couldn't shake the unease. Who was Marco Rossi? Why had my grandfather chosen him, and why me? Someone no one took seriously for this task. Springfield came into view in the late afternoon under a gray sky and the biting chill of an Ohio winter. The small, peaceful town had cobblestone streets and modest wooden houses. I pulled up in front of 1427 Maple Street, a small weathered house with a front yard cluttered with woodworking tools and scattered planks. A wooden sign reading Rossi's Woodworks hung loosely by the door, swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, gripped the letter tightly, and knocked. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, a weathered face, and bright, lively eyes. He wore a flannel shirt with rolled-up sleeves covered in sawdust. "Who are you?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a faint Italian accent. "I'm Jeremy Morgan," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite my pounding heart. "I'm here to deliver this letter from my grandfather, Edward Morgan." His eyes narrowed as if the name stirred a distant memory. He took the letter from my hand, carefully breaking the wax seal. I stood there, awkward, unsure of what to say or do. Marco Rossi read the letter, his hands trembling slightly, his face shifting from surprise to emotion. He looked up at me, his eyes now filled with a feeling I couldn't quite decipher. "This letter," he said, his voice catching. "Do you know what it says?" I shook my head, curiosity rising within me. "No, I was only told to deliver it." Marco invited me inside, and I stepped into a small but cozy space filled with the scent of fresh wood and varnish. He placed the letter on the table next to a steaming cup of coffee. "Sit down, Jeremy," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I think you should hear this story." Marco began to tell his tale. Over 20 years ago, he was an Italian immigrant carpenter who came to America with a dream of building his own woodworking business. But life was tough. No one believed in his talent. No one wanted to hire an unknown immigrant. He worked odd jobs, scraping by in a rundown boarding house, his dream slowly fading. "They called me useless," Marco said, his voice bitter. "People looked at me like a failure with no future." Then my grandfather entered his life. Edward Morgan, already a successful businessman at the time, met Marco by chance in a furniture store. He saw the chairs, tables, and cabinets Marco had crafted by hand and recognized his talent. "He didn't just buy my work," Marco said, his eyes lighting up. "He loaned me money, interest-free, to start my workshop. He said, 'Marco, I believe you can do this. Just don't give up.' Thanks to that loan, Marco built his workshop. Now, Rossi's Woodworks wasn't just a small shop. It was a respected brand in Springfield, employing dozens of people." Pointing to the letter, Marco said, "Your grandfather forgave that debt long ago. This letter is the confirmation, and he wrote a message in it. Those who love their craft will always find their place if someone believes in them first." I sat there, stunned. My grandfather, the man I always thought was cold and distant, had done this? He had seen potential in a stranger, someone the world had turned its back on, and placed his trust in them? A wave of mixed emotions surged within me: admiration, confusion, and a hint of jealousy. Why had he never shown that kind of faith in me? "You know, Jeremy," Marco continued, his voice softer now, "your grandfather didn't just give me money, he gave me a chance. Something no one else dared to offer. And now I think he's doing the same for you." I looked at Marco, unsure how to respond. The mocking voices of my family still echoed in my mind, but Marco's sincerity, the warmth in his eyes, made me wonder, was this the first lesson my grandfather wanted me to learn? Trust, not just in others, but in myself. Before I left, Marco clasped my hand tightly. Thank you for bringing this letter. And Jeremy, don't let anyone make you think you're not worthy. If Edward Morgan chose you for this task, you're definitely not ordinary. I returned to my car, glancing at the wooden box, my heart heavy but flickering with a spark of light. The first letter had been delivered, and though I still didn't fully understand its meaning, I felt a small change within me. This journey wasn't just about delivering letters, it was a challenge, an opportunity to confront myself, and the legacy my grandfather had left behind. As I drove away from Springfield, I glanced at the 4 remaining letters in the box. They stayed silent, but I knew each one was a door to another lesson. And I, though still doubtful, began to feel a small flame kindling in my heart. Trust, the kind Marco had received, the kind my grandfather placed in me, was perhaps the first key to unlocking my own path. My old Honda Civic glided along the highway, its groaning engine blending with the tangled thoughts in my mind. Marco Rossi's story still echoed like a slow but powerful melody, making it impossible for me to stop thinking about my grandfather. Edward Morgan, the man I once thought was cold and distant, turned out to have hidden depths I'd never understood. He had given Marco a chance, a spark of trust, and now, through that letter, he seemed to be offering me something similar, but I still wasn't sure what it was. A test? A final jest? Or a legacy I wasn't yet ready to recognize? I opened the wooden box on the passenger seat and pulled out the second letter. The red wax seal had faded, but my grandfather's sharp handwriting stood out as if he were sitting right here, looking at me with his familiar piercing gaze. Deliver this letter to Richard Coleman, 312 Oak Avenue, Wichita, Kansas. The note read, no explanation, no hints, just another address and another stranger's name. Wichita was nearly an 8-hour drive from Chicago, a longer journey than the one to Springfield. I sighed, doubt creeping back in, but after meeting Marco, I no longer wanted to turn back. If the first letter had taught me about trust, what would this one bring? I requested a few more days off work, citing family matters. My boss, a perpetually grumpy middle-aged man, just shrugged and said, "Don't let your work pile up when you get back, Jeremy." I nodded, but deep down I no longer cared much about that dead-end job. Something was shifting inside me, a small spark, an urge to discover what my grandfather truly wanted me to do. The road to Wichita was long and exhausting. The Kansas plains stretched out before me, flat and endless, like a monochromatic painting under a gray sky. I stopped at a gas station halfway, filling the tank and buying a bitter cup of coffee to stay alert. Sitting in the car, I looked at the letter in my hand, wondering who Richard Coleman was. Another craftsman? A businessman? Or just another piece of the puzzle my grandfather had left behind? I had no answers, but I knew I had to keep going. Wichita appeared in the early morning as the first rays of sunlight lit up the wide streets and low-rise buildings. 312 Oak Avenue was a modest but well-kept 2-story house with a small sign out front, Coleman Transport. I parked the car, checked the letter in my hand, and took a deep breath. My heart was pounding, not from nervousness, but from the strange feeling that I was about to step into another story. One that didn't belong to me but might change me. I knocked on the door and an elderly man, at least 80 years old, answered. He had silver hair, a weathered face, and bright eyes that seemed to have witnessed countless ups and downs. He wore a neat blue shirt, but his gnarled hands and faint scars on his fingers suggested he wasn't someone who spent his life behind a desk. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice deep and slightly wary. "I'm Jeremy Morgan," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm here to deliver this letter from my grandfather, Edward Morgan." My grandfather's name made Coleman pause. His eyes narrowed as if searching for a distant memory. He took the letter from my hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he broke the wax seal. I stood there, awkward, feeling like an intruder in a moment that wasn't mine. Coleman read the letter, his face shifting from surprise to emotion and finally to a sad smile. He looked up at me, his eyes now filled with a warmth, as if he were seeing a long-lost relative. "You're Edward's grandson," he said, his voice low but warm. "Come in, Jeremy." There's something you need to know. I stepped into the house, a simple but cozy space with family photos on the walls and the faint smell of coffee in the air. Coleman invited me to sit, placing the letter on the table and beginning to tell his story. His words nearly took my breath away. Over 40 years ago, when my grandfather was a young, ambitious businessman on the brink of bankruptcy, Richard Coleman was the one who saved him. At the time, Richard was a small-scale investor, not wealthy, but he had an unshakable belief in those who dared to dream big. My grandfather, in a moment of desperation, sought out Richard to borrow money, not just to save his company, but to preserve his honor. Edward came to my house one rainy night. Richard recounted, his eyes gleaming with the memory. He stood at my door, soaking wet, but his eyes were still burning with determination. He said, "Richard, I just need one chance. I'll repay you tenfold." Richard loaned my grandfather the money, not because he had plenty to spare, but because he believed in the man Edward Morgan was. He didn't just provide funds. He spent hours offering advice, sharing experiences, and bolstering my grandfather's confidence. Thanks to that loan, my grandfather revived his company, built Morgan Enterprises, and became the legend my family revered. But what stunned me was that Richard never told this story to anyone. He didn't seek fame or recognition. He simply did what he believed was right. "This letter," Richard said, holding the paper with reverence, "is a copy of an old contract long since settled. But with it is a message from your grandfather. No one succeeds alone. Gratitude for those who save you, that's the most enduring strength." I sat there, stunned. My grandfather didn't just repay Richard's loan. Years later, when Richard himself faced ruin, his transportation company went bankrupt and the press branded him a failure, my grandfather quietly stepped in to help him rebuild. He didn't boast or demand gratitude. He simply did what he believed was right, just as Richard had once done for him. After that failure, Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought I'd lost everything. But Edward showed up, handed me a sum of money and said, 'Richard, now it's my turn. You deserve another chance.' Thanks to him, I rebuilt Coleman Transport. Today, my company is thriving, and I've never forgotten his kindness." I looked at Richard, a surge of emotions welling up inside me. Gratitude, the kind my grandfather and Richard shared, wasn't just words. It was action, the way they lifted each other up in their darkest moments. But I also felt a pang in my heart. Why had my grandfather never shared these stories with me? Why did he let me grow up in his shadow, believing I was nothing in his eyes? As if reading my thoughts, Richard placed a hand on my shoulder. "Jeremy, your grandfather didn't choose you to deliver this letter by chance. He saw something in you, something you might not see in yourself yet. Don't let doubt cloud your path." I left Richard's house as the sun began to set, clutching the wooden box with the 3 remaining letters. His words echoed in my mind like a flame that kept burning. Gratitude, not just thanking someone, but living in a way that honors what they've given you. My grandfather had taught me this through Richard, and I began to feel that each letter wasn't just a task, but a piece of a larger picture of the person I could become. As I drove away, I glanced at the box. 3 letters remained waiting for me, and I knew this journey was far from over. But for the first time, I felt a small certainty in my heart that I wasn't just a messenger. I was Jeremy Morgan, and I was learning to live up to my grandfather's legacy, one letter at a time. Night had fallen as I drove back from Wichita, the headlights of my Honda Civic cutting through the darkness on the highway. Richard Coleman's story lingered in my mind, like a slow, resonant melody filled with power. My grandfather, Edward Morgan, was not just a shrewd businessman, but a man who valued those who had helped him. Gratitude, as Richard had said, wasn't just words. It was action, a way of living. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling a small flame in my heart burning brighter than ever. But alongside it was a question. Where would the next letter take me, and what lesson awaited? Back at my apartment, I collapsed onto a chair, exhausted, and placed the wooden box on the table. The dim light in the small room illuminated its worn, glossy surface. making the wood grain look like untold stories. I opened the box and pulled out the third letter. The red wax seal had faded, but my grandfather's sharp handwriting remained, commanding as if it couldn't be defied. "Deliver this letter to Charles Peterson, 789 Jefferson Boulevard, Detroit, Michigan," it read. Another stranger's name, another new address, and not a single word of explanation. The next day, I continued my journey of delivering letters, accompanied by my old Honda Civic on the cold, drizzly road to Detroit. The city appeared before me on a gloomy morning, its old industrial buildings mixed with revitalized neighborhoods. 789 Jefferson Boulevard was a modern office building, a stark contrast to the modest homes in Springfield and Wichita. A large sign out front read Peterson Properties, with smaller text below, "Real Estate and Investment." My heart beat faster. Charles Peterson was clearly no ordinary man. Who was he in my grandfather's world? I stepped into the building's lobby, feeling out of place in the luxurious space with its marble floors and abstract paintings on the walls. The receptionist, a young woman with a professional smile, asked if I had an appointment. I'm here to see Mr. Charles Peterson," I said, my voice slightly shaky. "I have a letter from Edward Morgan." The name Edward Morgan made her pause for a moment before she quickly made a call. Within minutes, I was escorted to the top floor where Charles Peterson awaited. He was a tall man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair neatly combed and eyes as sharp as my grandfather's. He wore an expensive suit, but his smile was surprisingly warm. "Jeremy Morgan," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "Edward's grandson. I've heard about you." I felt awkward, wondering what he'd heard, probably the story of the delivery boy mocked by my entire family. I handed him the letter, my hand trembling slightly as it brushed the red wax seal. Charles took it carefully as if holding a treasure. He read it silently, his face shifting from curiosity to contemplation, and finally to a faint smile. He folded the letter, looked at me, and said, "Sit down, Jeremy. You need to hear this story." I sat in a leather chair in his spacious office, looking out at the sprawling view of Detroit through the window. Charles began to speak, and each word drew me into a world I'd never known. Over 30 years ago, Charles Peterson was my grandfather's greatest rival in the real estate industry. At the time, Morgan Enterprises was on the rise, but Peterson Properties was a giant in Detroit with a string of major projects. "Edward and I were sworn enemies," Charles said, his voice tinged with humor as he recalled. "We fought over every piece of land, every contract, every client." I thought he was arrogant, and I'm sure he thought the same of me. In a major deal in downtown Detroit, my grandfather and Charles competed fiercely for a prime piece of land. Edward Morgan, with his intelligence and decisiveness, won. Charles lost, not just the contract, but his reputation. "I thought about revenge," Charles admitted, a cold glint in his eyes. "I wanted to take Edward down to prove he wasn't the best." But what happened next stunned Charles. Instead of crushing him, my grandfather extended a hand. Edward proposed a partnership, inviting Charles to join a joint project, sharing profits and opportunities. "I couldn't believe my ears," Charles said. "Who partners with their rival?" "But your grandfather told me, today's competitor can be tomorrow's ally. Fairness and respect are the foundation of collaboration." The letter I delivered was a copy of the first partnership agreement between them, signed decades ago. Attached was a message from my grandfather. Never humiliate a rival. Turn competition into shared strength. Charles looked at me, his eyes bright. Thanks to Edward, I not only regained my standing, but became Morgan Enterprises' biggest partner. Today, our companies are still working together, creating projects bigger than anything we ever dreamed. I sat there, stunned. My grandfather, who I thought won at all costs, understood the value of fairness and collaboration. He didn't just defeat his rival. He turned him into an ally, building a lasting relationship based on respect. But what moved me most was how Charles spoke of my grandfather, not just as a partner, but as a friend. I left Charles's office as the sunset painted Detroit's sky red. Fairness and collaboration weren't just business lessons, they were a way of living, a way of treating those around you. My grandfather had taught me this through Charles, and I began to feel that each letter wasn't just a task, but a piece of a larger picture of the person I wanted to become. Back at my Chicago apartment, I took out the fourth letter. The red wax seal had faded, but my grandfather's sharp, precise handwriting exuded a stern authority like a silent command. Deliver this letter to the Hope Haven Foundation, 456 Lincoln Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. I froze. Chicago? Less than 30 minutes drive from here. After long journeys to Ohio, Kansas, and Michigan, why was my grandfather bringing me back to where it all began? The name Hope Haven Foundation stirred a vague memory, like an old story I'd heard as a child but couldn't quite recall. What was it, and why was it so significant in his plan? I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Part of me wanted to wait until morning to rest after days of exhaustion. But a faint, persistent voice inside urged me to go now. Something about this letter, this address, gave me a sense that this was no ordinary task. I carefully placed the wooden box in my bag and got into the car. The Chicago night was quiet, with only the sound of the wind whistling through the window and the streetlights casting long streaks across the windshield, as if guiding me into a new chapter of the story my grandfather had already written. 456 Lincoln Avenue appeared under the dim glow of streetlights. A low building nestled behind rustling maple trees. A sign out front read, Hope Haven Foundation, with smaller text below, supporting orphaned children and struggling families. My heart beat faster, not out of nervousness, but from a strange feeling that I was about to touch a hidden part of my grandfather, a part my family had never mentioned. I knocked on the door, unsure if anyone would be there at this hour. After a moment, the door opened, and an elderly woman with neatly tied silver hair appeared. She wore a simple sweater, but her warm, bright eyes instantly made me feel welcomed. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice gentle but tinged with curiosity. "I'm Jeremy Morgan," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the unease in my chest. "I'm here to deliver this letter from my grandfather, Edward Morgan, for the Hope Haven Foundation." She paused, her eyes widening at the mention of Edward Morgan's name. "Edward," she whispered, as if the name had unlocked a long-sealed door of memory. She invited me inside, leading me through a small hallway adorned with children's hand-drawn pictures on the walls. The space was warm, filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies and the distant sound of children's laughter. She introduced herself as Margaret Hayes, the director of the Hope Haven Foundation, and invited me to sit at a wooden table in her small office. I handed her the letter, my palm tightening slightly as my fingers brushed the faded red wax seal. Margaret held the letter, her eyes fixed on the handwriting, as if reading something sacred. A moment of silence passed, and I noticed a glimmer in the corner of her eyes, as if she were holding back a deep emotion. She folded the paper and looked up at me, her gaze gentle but carrying an untold story. "Jeremy, do you have any guesses about what awaits you through this letter?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. I shook my head, feeling small under her gaze. "No, ma'am. I was only told to deliver it." Margaret smiled faintly and set the letter down beside a small framed photo on the table. "Sit down, Jeremy," she said, her voice carrying a sincerity I couldn't refuse. "There's a story you need to hear. A story I believe your grandfather wanted you to understand through this task." She began to speak, and each word pulled me into another corner of my grandfather's life, one I'd never known. The Hope Haven Foundation was established over 40 years ago, when my grandfather was a young entrepreneur struggling to build Morgan Enterprises. Back then, he stumbled upon a group of orphaned children living in a Chicago slum. He didn't just see hungry kids, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. He saw potential in them, dreams buried by poverty. Edward came to me when I was just a young teacher and said, "Margaret, we have to do something. No one should be left behind." With the little money he had in those early days of his business, my grandfather funded the creation of the Hope Haven Foundation. He didn't just give money, he gave his time, building educational programs, providing scholarships, and ensuring that orphaned children and struggling families had a chance to rise. Edward didn't want anyone to know he was behind it, Margaret said, her eyes sparkling. He always said, "Doing good doesn't need a name. It just needs to be right." The letter I delivered was a long-term funding commitment from my grandfather, ensuring the Hope Haven Foundation would continue its work even after his death. Attached was a message. A company is only truly strong when tied to its responsibility to the community. A great entrepreneur doesn't just create profit but leaves a human legacy. Margaret looked at me, her voice lowering. Thanks to Edward, thousands of children have had the chance to learn, to work, to live better lives. He didn't just build a business empire, he built hope for those who needed it most. I sat there, my chest tightening as if squeezed. My grandfather, the man I'd thought cared only about money and power, had a heart this big. He had quietly changed the lives of thousands without ever seeking recognition. But what pained me was that I'd never known this. I grew up in the Morgan family hearing stories of his intelligence and decisiveness, but no one ever spoke of his heart, of the things he did for others. "Jeremy," Margaret said, placing her hand on mine, "your grandfather chose you to deliver this letter because he believed you'd understand. Social responsibility isn't just about giving. It's how we live, how we leave our mark on the world. You carry the Morgan name, and you can carry on that legacy." I left the Hope Haven Foundation as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight illuminating Chicago's streets. Margaret's words echoed in my mind like a breeze fanning the flame in my heart. Social responsibility wasn't just charity. It was living with a greater purpose, creating value not just for oneself but for the community. Only one letter remained, and I knew it would be the greatest challenge yet. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was Jeremy Morgan, and I was learning to live up to my grandfather's legacy, one letter at a time. Back in my apartment, I took a deep breath and opened the lid, pulling out the fifth letter, the final one. The red wax seal had faded with time, but my grandfather's familiar handwriting stood out clearly, like a message echoing from the past. I stared at the address on the envelope, my heart stopping. Jeremy Morgan, 1423 Maple Street, Chicago, Illinois. My address. My entire body froze, my hands trembling as I held the letter. My grandfather had written this final letter to me. After all the long journeys and stories about others, why did the end point circle back to the beginning? And why was I the chosen one? I stood there, the fifth letter in my hand, feeling as if the world was shrinking around me. My small apartment, once a temporary refuge in my aimless life, now held a different meaning. I looked at the words Jeremy Morgan on the envelope, my grandfather's handwriting like a call, a command, and a promise. I grabbed a letter opener, carefully slicing through the wax seal, and unfolded the letter. His strong, clear handwriting appeared as if he were standing before me, his piercing gaze cutting through to my soul. Jeremy, my grandson. If you're reading this letter, it means you've overcome the 4 previous challenges. You've met Marco, Richard, Charles, and Hope Haven, the people and place I chose to teach you about trust, gratitude, fairness, and responsibility to the community. But this letter is for no one else. It's for you, because you are the only one I trust to carry my legacy further. You were once looked down upon by the family, seen as unworthy of the Morgan name. But I saw in you a spark, an intellect, and a heart they never recognized. I'm not leaving you property or money because those things can vanish. I'm leaving you lessons so you can forge your own path. In this box, you'll find a document, a portfolio I prepared long ago. It's not a gift for you to squander, but a tool for you to create greater value. But remember, Jeremy, wealth is not the destination, but the means. If you've internalized the 4 lessons before this, you'll know how to use it. If not, it will only be a burden. Don't let doubt or the mockery of others define you. You are Jeremy Morgan, and you can surpass everything I've ever achieved. Live worthy of yourself. Edward Morgan. I folded the letter, a surge of emotion rising within me like waves crashing against the shore. My eyes stung, not from the humiliation I felt the day the will was read, but from a sense of appreciation and pride. My grandfather had seen me, truly seen me, when the rest of the family saw only a failure. I opened the wooden box, and just as he wrote, beneath the lining was a thin document detailing a portfolio, stocks, small real estate holdings, and an investment fund designed for long-term growth. It wasn't the millions my parents or James received, but it was a starting point, an opportunity my grandfather believed I could turn into something greater. I sank into the chair, clutching the letter, feeling my heart beat stronger than ever. For the first time, I didn't feel like a useless nobody, the family's laughingstock. My grandfather hadn't left me an empty box. He'd left me a challenge, a map to discover my true self. But above all, he'd left me faith. Faith that I could become a man worthy of the Morgan name. In the weeks that followed, I began studying the portfolio. It wasn't large, but it was built with the intelligence and vision only my grandfather possessed. I decided to quit my job at the finance company despite my boss's skeptical looks and the whispers from colleagues. I knew I no longer belonged there. With the capital from the portfolio, I founded Morgan Ventures, a small real estate company focused on supporting people like Marco, those with passion but lacking opportunity. I carried the 4 lessons with me: trust in talent, gratitude for those who help, fair competition, and living for the community. The early years were tough. I worked tirelessly, facing failures, doubts, and sneers from my family. But whenever I felt like giving up, I opened the 5th letter and reread my grandfather's words. They were like a gust of wind, reigniting my resolve. I wasn't just a mail carrier. I was Jeremy Morgan, and I could do more. 9 years have passed, and Morgan Ventures has grown into more than just a business. It's a tight-knit team, a collection of projects that bring value to the community, and a reputation built on integrity. Meanwhile, I heard news about my family. My father, my mother, James, and the relatives who once mocked me had sold off their inherited assets, squandered their wealth, and made poor investments. Morgan Enterprises, my grandfather's empire, was crumbling under their management. In the early years of building Morgan Ventures, I barely had time to think about my family. Every day was a battle, from finding partners and convincing investors to ensuring each real estate project delivered real value. But in my heart, I always carried my grandfather's 5 letters like torches lighting my path. Trust from Marco, gratitude from Richard, fairness from Charles, social responsibility from Hope Haven, and above all, belief in myself from the 5th letter. These weren't just lessons, they were the guiding principles for every decision I made. I didn't build Morgan Ventures to prove anything to my family but to live up to my grandfather's legacy. Yet life, like a river, always brings unexpected news. Bits and pieces about my family reached me at first through whispers from mutual friends or fleeting articles online. My father, Robert Morgan, who once prided himself as the heir to my grandfather's empire, now appeared in less flattering stories. He had sold the Lake Forest mansion, the greatest gift in the will, to fund a risky real estate venture in Miami. The project failed, costing millions and tarnishing his reputation. My Aunt Ellen sold her properties in Florida and California to buy shares in a tech startup, only to watch it go bankrupt within 2 years. And James, my arrogant cousin who called me the delivery boy, had blown through his $2 million on luxury cars, European vacations, and failed investments due to his lack of vision. Morgan Enterprises, the empire my grandfather spent his life building, began to falter. My father, as chairman, couldn't control the internal disputes among shareholders, mostly my relatives. They fought over personal interests, made hasty decisions, and let incompetent managers run the company. Major projects stalled, clients turned away, and the reputation of Morgan Enterprises, once a symbol of success, eroded. I read an article in the Chicago Tribune with a stark headline, "Morgan Enterprises, an empire crumbling due to poor management." It mentioned my father, but not a single word about me. Strangely, that brought me relief. I didn't want to be part of that failure. Meanwhile, Morgan Ventures took a different path. I started with the small investment portfolio my grandfather left me, but I didn't rush. I chose modest real estate projects, focusing on building affordable housing for people like Marco Rossi, those with dreams but lacking opportunities. I hired a team not based on flashy resumes but on passion and integrity. I remembered Richard Coleman's words, "No one succeeds alone." So I expressed gratitude to everyone I worked with, from engineers to administrative staff, ensuring they felt valued. I learned from Charles Peterson, turning competitors into partners, signing deals with small but promising companies. And from Hope Haven, I understood that a business isn't just about profit. It must create value for the community. Morgan Ventures funded local schools, built parks, and supported programs for underprivileged children, things I knew my grandfather would be proud of. But my success didn't come easily. There were sleepless nights worrying about bank loans, contracts that could fail, and skeptical looks from investors. There were days I questioned if I was on the right path, if I was truly worthy of my grandfather's trust. In those moments, I opened the wooden box and reread the fifth letter. My grandfather's words were like a breeze, reigniting my resolve. Don't let doubt or the mockery of others define you. And I pressed on step by step, building Morgan Ventures into a company that was not only profitable but meaningful. Meanwhile, my family sank deeper into trouble. James, my cousin who once flaunted yacht photos and lavish parties on Instagram, was now rumored to be drowning in debt. Aunt Ellen, who mocked me at the will reading, had to sell her Chicago home to pay off creditors. My mother, always impeccable in appearance, now rarely appeared in public, as if avoiding curious stares. And my father, the man who was once the epitome of confidence in our family, had become quiet, his eyes heavy with fatigue and disappointment. One autumn afternoon, I received a call from my father. His voice on the phone was frail, no longer resonant as it once was. "Jeremy," he said, "we need to talk." "About Morgan Enterprises." I stood by the window of Morgan Ventures' small office, looking down at the Chicago streets bathed in the golden hues of sunset. My father's call made me pause, like a stone rippling the calm surface of a lake in my heart. Over the past 9 years, I had built Morgan Ventures from nothing, turning it into a respected real estate company with projects that brought value to the community and a team as close as family. I had learned from my grandfather's 5 letters, trust, gratitude, fairness, responsibility, and belief in myself, to become a leader I never thought I could be. But my family, the ones who mocked me at the will reading, were now begging for help. Morgan Enterprises, the empire my grandfather Edward Morgan had built, was teetering on the brink of collapse. And I, the boy once called a delivery boy, now had to face them. I agreed to meet my father at the old Morgan Enterprises office, not to gloat, but because a part of me still felt a responsibility to my grandfather's legacy. As I stepped into the building, memories from 9 years ago flooded back. The luxurious wood-paneled room, the scornful glances, and James's mocking laughter when I received the wooden box with 5 letters. But now, the space was different. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, the paintings on the walls had faded, and the air was heavy with the weight of failure. My father sat at the head of the conference table, his hair now completely white, his face more weathered than ever. James, my cousin, sat in a corner, his eyes averted, devoid of the arrogance he once had. Aunt Ellen and a few other relatives were present, but none dared to meet my gaze. My mother was absent. I'd heard she had left Chicago, living quietly in a small town to escape the whispers about our family's decline. "Jeremy," my father began, his voice trembling as if each word was wrung from a shattered sense of pride. "The company is in trouble. We've lost major contracts, investors are pulling out, and we need you." He paused, his eyes meeting mine, no longer those of an authoritative father, but of a man pleading for help. A wave of mixed emotions surged within me, pity, anger, and a touch of sadness. This was the family that had made me a laughingstock, that had seen me as worthless. Yet now they were bowing their heads to me, the one they once despised. I remained silent, letting the tension linger. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands clasped tightly as if holding back something. Aunt Ellen, who had once mocked me with her sweet but cutting smile, now looked down, fidgeting with the ring on her finger. I wasn't here for revenge or to boast about Morgan Ventures. I came because I carried the Morgan name and because I wanted to protect my grandfather's legacy. Not by crushing my family, but by doing what was right. Dad, I said, my voice calm but firm, I built Morgan Ventures on the lessons my grandfather left me. I didn't just make money, I built a team, created value for the community, and upheld integrity. Morgan Enterprises can be saved, but not by continuing the way you've been doing things. James finally spoke, his voice sharp, but unable to mask his unease. You think you're better than us, don't you? You were just a kid with a wooden box, Jeremy, and now you're going to lecture us? His words were like a knife, but they no longer cut as they did 9 years ago. I looked straight into his eyes, unflinching. I'm not lecturing anyone, James, I replied, but I learned from my grandfather that a company isn't just about money or power. It's about trust, gratitude, fairness, and responsibility. You all had everything, properties, shares, millions of dollars, but you let it slip away. I had nothing but 5 letters, and now I stand here with a thriving company while Morgan Enterprises is crumbling. The room fell silent. James looked down, saying nothing more. My father stared at me, his eyes a mix of pain and surprise, as if seeing a son he had never truly known. I pulled a document from my briefcase, a restructuring plan I had prepared in advance for Morgan Enterprises. It wasn't a takeover, but a proposal for collaboration. I suggested merging parts of Morgan Enterprises with Morgan Ventures, using my team to manage the remaining projects while instilling the values I had learned. Partnering with small but promising companies, investing in the community, and rebuilding trust with clients. This isn't about me taking control of the company, I said, sliding the plan toward my father. It's about saving my grandfather's legacy. But you have to change. No more fighting for personal gain, no more reckless decisions. If you agree, Morgan Ventures will help. If not, I won't waste my time. My father took the plan, flipping through its pages with trembling hands. I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, but also shame. He knew that I, the son he had once been disappointed in, was now the only one who could save what was left of Morgan Enterprises. Aunt Ellen spoke up, her voice soft and stripped of its former arrogance. Jeremy, we were wrong to judge you. Will you do this for the family? I looked at her, recalling her mocking smile at the will reading, but I felt no anger, only a cold clarity. I'm doing this for my grandfather, I said, and for what he taught me. But if the family wants to be part of it, you have to prove you're worthy. The meeting ended in a heavy but meaningful atmosphere. My father agreed to the plan, though I knew he did so with deeply wounded pride. James said nothing more, but the look in his eyes as he left the room was a reluctant acknowledgement that I had surpassed him. I stepped out of the Morgan Enterprises building, the autumn Chicago wind blowing through, carrying the crisp scent of fallen leaves as they swirled on the sidewalk. I paused, looking up at the building that once symbolized the empire my grandfather, Edward Morgan, had built. Now it was merely a faded shadow, its dusty windows reflecting the weak glow of the sunset. 9 years ago, I had left this very room in humiliation, clutching the wooden box like a final mockery from my family. Today, I stood here not as a failure, but as a man who had found his path, guided by my grandfather's 5 letters. I drove back to the Morgan Ventures office, my heart filled with a strange sense of peace. The office welcomed me with its familiar warmth. My employees, people I considered my true family, were bustling with work. One group discussed a low-cost housing project in Chicago's suburbs, while another prepared documents for a scholarship program we funded for underprivileged children. I walked in, and they looked up, smiling. There was no tension or rivalry like at Morgan Enterprises. Here we worked for a shared purpose, driven by the values my grandfather had passed down. I gathered everyone and shared the plan to collaborate with Morgan Enterprises. We're not just saving a company, I said firmly, but preserving a legacy, one of trust, integrity, and responsibility. They nodded, their eyes bright with agreement, and I knew I had built a team that worked not just for profit but for something greater. In the months following the meeting, I dove into restructuring Morgan Enterprises. We brought in the Morgan Ventures team, applying the strategies that had made us successful, partnering with small but promising companies, investing in community projects, and rebuilding trust with clients. I worked closely with my father, though it wasn't always easy. He maintained a tough exterior, but I saw a change in his eyes. Not submission, but a belated respect. He began to listen, ask questions, and on rare occasions even smiled when I shared stories of the community projects Morgan Ventures had undertaken. James, after the meeting, all but disappeared. I heard he had left Chicago, carrying his debts and what little pride he had left. Aunt Ellen reached out once via email, writing briefly, "Jeremy, you've done what we couldn't. Thank you." I read the email but didn't reply. Morgan Enterprises slowly came back to life, not as the flashy empire of old, but as a sustainable company tied to the community. One of the first projects I launched was a low-cost housing complex inspired by the Hope Haven Foundation for struggling families in Chicago. When the project was completed, I invited Margaret Hayes to the opening ceremony. She stood beside me, watching children play in the new playground, and families smile as they received their keys. She took my hand, her voice choked with emotion. "Edward would be so proud of you, Jeremy. You haven't just carried on his legacy, you've made it shine brighter." Her words sent a wave of warmth through me, as if my grandfather were somewhere watching with his sharp but satisfied gaze. One morning, while reviewing Morgan Ventures' financial reports, I received a handwritten letter at the office. There was no sender's name, only a familiar red wax seal. I opened it and my father's trembling handwriting appeared. "Dear Jeremy, my son. I was wrong not to believe in you. I let pride blind me and I lost what your grandfather built. But you've done what I couldn't. I'm proud of you, though I know these words come too late. Thank you for saving Morgan Enterprises, and thank you for being a better man than I was. Robert Morgan." I folded my father's letter, a gentle calm spreading through me. His apology wasn't something I had expected, but it closed old wounds. I placed the letter in the wooden box beside my grandfather's 5 letters, the pieces of a journey from humiliation to growth, from doubt to forgiveness. My family, my father, James, Aunt Ellen, had everything, but they chose to squander and fight. I, with 5 letters, chose a different path, living with trust, gratitude, fairness, responsibility, and belief in myself. The wooden box on my shelf was no longer a mockery but a treasure, a reminder that the true legacy is the lessons that shape who we are. I am Jeremy Morgan, and I have lived worthily, not by defeating anyone, but by living true to a purpose: trust, gratitude, fairness, and responsibility. Ability, 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 ability,